A lot of this work that I've been doing has also been with a lady who actually teaches at the University of Turkey. Her name is Songul Sentuklu, and she's been working with me on this stuff, and so she made some of these slides. I won't give her credit for all of them, but she made some of these slides, so I have to give her credit for some. Anyway, so let's move along. One of the things that we are faced with is some real changes in agriculture. Now, this change isn't going to take place rapidly. Will it, Ann?
Not here.
Not here, she says. Well, maybe not anywhere. I don't know. But I know that this relationship from traditional mainstream farming approaches into more of an alternative approach, where we're not buying as much fertilizer, we're not bringing in as many, we're being able to handle pests a little bit better, is a new type. It's really not new. It's like if we went back to the turn of the century, in around 1900 and in those years, that's how our farmers farmed. So we're going back and dredging up some of the things that were done before and bringing them up to today. We've got newer technology. We've got a lot of science involved today that they didn't have then, but they figured out that they could use the culture through cultural practices, they made progress. And of course they don't have yield and kind of varieties that we have today, but they did some things that were good. Well, if we look at soil health principles, and I'm going to just touch on a little bit of it because these are some of the basis upon which we put this piece of research together. And part of that is to use a minimum type of disturbance, to disturb this soil as little as possible. And by doing that, we're using no-till seeding and no-till planting for our row crops or our small grains. The other thing that we like to see, and as part of this whole formula, is diversity in our crops. So in here you have to see some sunflowers. Here's a cover crop. Here's some field pea and barley that have been previously swathed that these cattle are grazing. A little bit different thought process and thinking. Over here, we want to see a living root in that soil as long as we possibly can, and to keep the soil covered with some kind of residue. So we've got some new fall growth here. That's a triticale hairy vetch field. Here's some residue and stubbles. Here we've got some sunflower residue in that particular field. And maintaining that root as long as we can, and of course with frost coming on as soon as it does in North Dakota, that becomes a challenge. We have crops within these cover crop fields that actually are pretty tolerant to frost. So we can take advantage of that. When we talk about diversity of crops, in this particular piece of research, what I did when I started this thing, put it together, I took a look at what's being done traditionally. It's not uncommon to see spring wheat or small grains, at least, farmed continuously, crop after crop after crop of wheat. Continuous wheat is not uncommon in many cases. So I took a look and I said, well, if I didn't raise wheat in that situation, and I went over here and instead of raising wheat continuously, if I made wheat as one of the crops in a rotation, and that rotation included several crops, then if I took those several crops and created diversity from it, what would happen if I not only had diversity, but I did bring in some livestock grazing? And indeed, we've got some crops here that cattle can graze. We've got corn. You can combine corn. You can make silage out of it, or you can graze it standing on the stalk. Here's some field pea barley that precedes the sunflower crop. So if you notice, you're gradually seeing that we've taken a high-value crop here, and corn would be considered a high-value crop. And preceding those high-value crops, we've put in a cover crop, type of crop that would help feed the soil as well as produce forage for livestock. And the same thing here. Here's some forage. It precedes a high-value crop. And so that's the thought behind it, is to feed these high-value crops with a forage type crop that helps keep a green root in the ground, a green plant if we can. And so if I take a look at those crops, you probably saw that in the slides, but where does the income come from? Our high-value crops bring us income from wheat and from sunflowers. Our livestock income comes from, in this case, and what we put together was yearling steers raising, first of all, native range, and then a sequence of from that field pea barley and then into corn. And in this particular study, you've got an arrow here that drops off the screen that says those cattle go to the feed yard. And indeed they do. And then, well, there's some savings. We've got cows that can graze some of these residues, cover crops, crop residues, corn residues, sunflower residue, and cover crops themselves. So we get grazing in two different situations. One where we have a fairly sharp increase in income, and another one where we cut the cost of maintaining cows. If I take a look at that spring wheat, and we've been doing this now since 2011, so we have 5 crop years involved, and this is the average wheat yield, whether it be the control or the wheat yield in the rotation, is the same. No difference over 5 years. Identical. But what happened to get to this average yield is really quite different. Actually quite really. If I look at spring wheat yield for this control crop, I see that we have no difference. This is your control, and here's your rotation wheat. If you could draw a line, what happens here? Notice this line is going this way. What's this line doing? But the average, if you take the 5-year average of the two, is identical. This, what we look at here, is actually a function of nutrient cycle. Okay, and I'm not going to get into that because I don't know anything about that stuff. But this is a function of nutrient cycling, and because of that, that soil is working for us. We don't have to bring. We had to go through this year right here. The third year is the transition year, and I say this is where it started. Actually, it didn't start. It started right here in the very first year. As we began this process of those crops feeding the subsequent crop, it began at the beginning, and we see it, and this was a pretty good deal right here because wheat was what, $7, $8 a bushel. That was a money maker right in these years here. But now, not quite so valuable in this particular year. Let's move on. We've got lots of other speakers. Well, what about fertilizer, commercial fertilizers? Commercial fertilizer certainly plays a role in agriculture. It plays a huge role, and they're building more plants all the time. If we look at these yellow boxes, I don't know what you probably should have done differently, but you can't see those. The yellow boxes is the amount of fertilizer that we applied in 2011. The blue box across there is the amount of fertilizer that we're going to apply in 2016. And I talked to Larry a little bit about this 85. And if you look at that 85 and then look at all the other ones, we put a little fertilizer on the head of our winter triticale hairy vetch in the fall of the year. We put on 12 pounds, and that's a whole mix of different elements. It's only about 6% nitrogen actually, pretty small. And I'm not convinced I need it, but it's in there. And then corn. That high-value crop, that corn needs the nutrients. We don't have quite enough nitrogen coming from that cover crop. This, by the way, this whole line of stuff is the cover crop. I should identify it better. But notice what's happened from the start of this project here to here.
Doug, so did you apply what was that you soil tested and by Latka University?
We did. So if you follow each year across here in different colors, and 13 and 15 and so forth, you'll see it's a busy slide. It's actually poor. Some who made the good ones, and I made the poor ones like this. Anyway, yes. And so if you follow each line across, it's really busy. You can sort out crop, like here in pea barley, we don't apply any fertilizer to a legume like that. And never did from the get-go. We didn't apply any fertilizer. But let's move on. Unless there's a question. Okay, we'll move on. So in these two slides here, I take a look at the input cost per acre and the gross return per acre. Okay, so we've got these two values. And you see our input costs in year 3 were high. They followed the yields that we were getting and the value of the crop, and those go up. As the value of the crop declined, the cost input per acre declined, as well as the cost of fertilizer declined. And you can see our gross returns. You notice year 3 followed this real high year of good returns on wheat. Your suppliers were out there trying to get some of that from you. And as we move down into year 5. So let's take a look at the net return. Where's your net return? In the beginning, as things began to build, you see now in year 3, we're still not showing a huge profit or any profit with our wheat in year 3 on the rotation wheat. But come year 4 and year 5 this year, notice we're now showing good profits without applying any nitrogen fertilizer. We're adding no nutrient. So maybe we can take a look at those other crops. The cover crop, for instance, in this situation, it's based on yield. In the first year, we didn't get a crop. We had no germination to speak of, and that's one of the big problems with cover crops is, are they actually going to germinate? And when they do, we can get some very nice yield. 2014, 2014 was not a particular good year. I don't know if that's true. We had all that moisture, and we had issues with falling numbers, but in the case of the cover, we just didn't get the growth. We didn't get the germination when we needed it. We had all this water that created all those problems in the fall during combining. And then come back in 2015 and we had a good crop again. Cover crops. So good story. We'll take a look at corn. We measure our corn both in grain and as silage, even though we graze it, but we take measurements of it. And you can see our corn, which is a forage type corn. You can see our yields here starting out the first year. We didn't do very well at all in our very first year. I know it's a mistake there. But then here in 2013, we got up to 88 bushels per acre, dropped in 14, and now this last year up to 73 bushels per acre of corn. In terms of silage, if we look at that tonnage, but again, if you draw that line in those fields, notice that line, slope of that line is going to be increasing as we have reduced the amount of nutrient. And in the case of corn, it needs so much nutrient that we're kind of up and down on the amount of nutrient that we apply to our corn, as you saw on that slide earlier. If I look at sunflower, you see again, in the beginning when we first started, not particularly high yields, rather embarrassing actually. But you notice again, increase up there close to a ton to the acre. Drop in 14 and then back up close to 1,900 pounds in 2015. So great sunflower years, these 2 years in a row. Oil content, about the same. That basically doesn't change it. Flowers. If we look at our field pea barley forage, the very first year I only grew peas, so it's kind of I made some changes in the project and went into grazing. So anyway, based on forage, you notice the same kind of thing, kind of a little flatter than the other crops, but again, this one is helping feed that sunflower crop that follows the field pea barley and the grazing that goes on with it. If I look at the crop rotation and the 5-year input cost, you can see those here. In our different crops here, your spring wheat control. Spring wheat rotation would be this bar. The yellow one is the cover crop. That kind of ugly looking color is the corn forage. Pea barley is here, and our sunflower is up here. You notice the sunflower and our rotation wheat costs us a little bit more. We have a little more fertilizer involved, not rotation, but in our control wheat. If you look at our gross returns, which I think is kind of interesting, the two wheats are fairly close, even though the control wheat had higher yields in the year when we had such a high value for wheat crop, that we took advantage of that. Our cover crop was a little bit cheaper. What I did to come up with these values for these forages was to evaluate them based on the tonnage of hay, if it were as hay. At $65 a ton is what I used for hay value to come up with this gross return. And then of course your grains and your oilseeds and corn and grain are based on, or corn and forage are based on the silage value, calculated back to dry matter in the case of silage. And you can see statistically there's a significant difference in those values. What about net return? Here's an interesting slide. If you take a look at those net returns, and we look at our control wheat and our rotation wheat, we got a $10 bill per acre in terms of dollars per acre in favor of that rotation wheat. That's interesting. And if you're growing 1,000 acres of wheat, that $10 is a nice check. It's a nice bit of money. Our cover crop in terms of hay, probably our lowest return in terms of dollars per acre net return. But we're still getting a net return to our cover crop, a positive response there. And at the same time, feeding cattle and feeding a subsequent crop. So we're doing a lot of things with that cover crop, and in this case, based on its hay value, we're showing ourselves a $50 net return per acre. If we look at the corn forage, and again, based on hay value, we're showing about a $62 return per acre. Our field pea barley here, about a $90 return per acre, and sunflower squashes them all. If you can handle sunflowers and you can deal with them, there is a potential. Now the price of flowers is dropped quite a bit. We're down quite a bit, but it is as an oilseed. And if you take a look at crops, you look at oilseeds, be they soybean, sunflower, canola, whatever oil, other oil type seed you might think of. Cranberry. There's money in oilseeds. I think there's more money in oilseeds, and you can see that here. In this particular case, we got twice as much return for sunflower than we did for wheat here. So, or either of these wheats, there's twice as much from sunflower. So sunflowers, and I have friends that raise the things, and they just go, wow, I wish I could quit growing sunflowers. They kind of hate them, but they like the paycheck, so they put up with the things. Anyway, just to show you again, as we look at some of those crops, we see that slope of the line is, whether it's in dollars and cents or whether it's in the yield. We see that. Here's a slide that we're getting to, and I put this in for Ann because I thought she'd get excited about that earthworm down there, you know. Those of you who don't know, Ann Fisher is from NRCS and works out of the Baker office. And so you were born and grew up here in Dickinson, didn't you? Yeah. So she came back home and kind of cried when she came to town. But here's that control wheat, and if you look at the soil and the plating, and Larry could probably tell you a lot more about this, the structure of this soil. But as we get over here, we tend to see more of a cottage cheese approach. In this area from here at the soil, and this is a field pea, excuse me. This is a triticale hairy vetch field, and you can see the the grain crop here. Notice here on the control, there's nothing, because nothing planted, but not even any volunteer wheat there that I can see. But here we've got, from here up to the surface is that area that's just loaded with organic matter, and it's in this zone, basically, that these earthworms are thriving, because we've got organic matter, and as you develop organic matter in these soils, these critters, these macro critters, these big guys, but there's billions of small organisms that live in the soil. I think of the soil, those of you who are cattlemen and have cows, we have ruminants, and the rumen on a cow, you can almost equate with this piece of soil, because these organisms that live, we can't see them without a microscope, but we have many organisms in the soil that are doing our work. And the same thing with the rumen. The organisms in the rumen are feeding the cow. And what do we do with our hay and our forages and our grains? We're feeding the organisms in the rumen. The organisms in the rumen subsequently feed the animal, and it produces beef from relatively undigestible material. But the organisms make it such that it can be turned into protein and energy and fat and muscle and good steaks. I'm going to stop here, Larry, and let you talk to us about soil health. Because I know if I talk about it, I'll say something else. Here we go. Let's see if we can find your slide. Yes. That one there. We want to get that out of the rough.
Okay, thank you. Well, my name is Larry Cihacek. I'm in the soil science department at NDSU. I hate words.
We're trying to ignore it.
I'm a wanderer when I talk, so this ties me down. But that's okay. I'll stay in place. I'm a soil science in the soil science department. My background is soil fertility, soil chemistry, soil management. And I'm sort of a generalist, but I've been around for a long time in North Dakota. I've been here almost 30 years. So, although some of you probably don't see me very often because I live on the other end of the state, that's sometimes a problem for us being out here. But I enjoy working out here. I've worked out here over the years a number of different times, either here or out at the ranch. Because this is a really unique environment out here as far as the state goes. Very interesting and a lot of potential. Anyhow, what I'm going to talk about a little bit is soil health and sort of set the stage for some of the things that Doug has been talking about. I'm trying to teach him some of this stuff, but sometimes it's hard to teach old dogs new tricks, but he's not doing too bad. At least he'll sit up and beg for his treat once in a while. So anyhow, I'm going to talk about the integrated system, but I'm going to start out with a little bit of a background on soil health and soil organic matter. I've done a lot of work in soil organic matter. In fact, one of the first studies I did was out here sort of surveying, I had a project at NRCS surveying the organic matter out here in the West River country. And that was back in the early 90s, 92 and 93 I think it was. And we published some stuff off of that stuff, found some interesting things dealing with soil carbon. But I've done a lot of other things with soil carbon over the years. Anyhow, I'm going to talk a little bit about soil health. Really, soil health's got a number of different functions. It's kind of hard to define what soil health is sometimes because we really can't always get our hands on it. It's not much different than our health, human health, you know. If we feel good, we're perky, we do our work, we do whatever we're going to do, and we feel pretty good. And we're pretty active, and we get a lot of things done. The soil sort of is the same way. Although the soil itself, if you take any of the microorganisms and plants out of there, is pretty inert. It's got some chemical things that that it has going for it, some physical things. But soil health covers a lot of functions. Number one is the soil productivity. If you get good soil health, you're going to have good crop yields usually. Now, again, this is sort of relative because there's some other features to soil, such as, you know, is there bedrock under near the surface? Is it sandy? Is it rocky? You probably saw that last slide here. We'll get to that later. But some of those things influence the productivity of the soil also. And what I'm talking about here, I have a bunch of stuff in there. I borrowed this from another talk I gave here a couple of weeks ago. But basically what I was talking about, organic matter, I'm going to sort of talk about that here also, because it's sort of the key to soil health, because that's what organisms need. Another function is cycling nutrients, and that's something that Doug and I are working on here. Holds water for plant use. If you have good soil health or soil tilth, sometimes we call it, good soil condition, good soil aggregation, we can conserve a lot of water in this country. Probably not so much from this group's interest, but it can filter soil contaminants out. I used to teach a course on soil and waste disposal. And one of the best ways to break down waste, industrial waste, depending on what they are, but is to put it on the soil, because the soil and its microorganisms are going to break it down to its basic element components. And it also, if we get good soil health, it resists erosion, both water and wind. So there's a lot of different components of soil health that are the things that the soil health impacts. One of the biggest components that contributes to soil health is organic matter. Out here in the west and in the east of the river valley, we've got soils, we've got 4 to 6% organic matter on the average, and probably under natural prairie it was higher than that, probably even as high as 8 to 10%. Out here, it's drier, so you naturally won't have as much plant biomass growing even under prairie conditions, although some of the pastures that we've been sampling out here have pretty good organic matter level, on the order of 4 or 5%. And that's remarkable, but again, it's because of fairly decent management. Organic matter is decomposed plant and animal residues. Okay, that jackrabbit that dies out there is going to decompose and it's going to enter organic matter. If you've got grasses on rangeland, you know, whatever's left out there will lay down, and over time it'll decompose and enter the organic matter. Plant roots. Plants, particularly grass plants, range grass plants, are really interesting because they do a lot to contribute to the organic matter. In fact, most of the highest organic matter soils in this country are most productive soils, and that's basically from here on south and east in the Corn Belt, are known as mollisols, meaning they've got dark surface horizons. And they develop under prairie. You get a little ways east of Fargo, maybe 20 miles east of Fargo, you run into forest soils, and those do not have the organic matter, and they are not as productive. They can be productive today, but on a scale of 1 to 100, they're probably, mollisols would be 100, and they would probably be about 60 or 70, maybe 75 on a rating scale, because they don't have the organic matter. They develop under forest vegetation. In forests, most organic matter is above ground. In prairies, most organic matter is in the soil because of the plant roots. If you think of the thousands of years the prairies were here, and the herds of buffaloes grazing these things, what they cause the grass, and a buffalo herd comes along, they'll just graze everything down. And they leave, for the most part. There's a few animals around, but the pressure is gone. It's just like rotational grazing. What happens is the grass plants are, as they grow above, they're creating photosynthase. The photosynthase go down to the roots where the plant food is stored in the roots. as the plants are growing, they're also growing root mass, which acts as a storage organ, but also gets the water and the nutrients the plants need. When you graze it down, there's no photosynthesis going back to the grass plant, to the roots. So what does the plant do? It self-prunes the roots off. It just sloughs them off. They die off, they slough off. But all that organic matter in the roots stays in the soil. It's retained in the soil. And so over centuries and millennia of grassland, we've got these dark surface horizon soils. Now when man came out and plowed it up, he kind of messed it up because he took the grass plants out of the way, and then we started burning organic matter. And when we started burning organic matter, we developed systems like crop fallow systems, which were very, very common out here until the mid to late 80s. And that changed when the Farm Bill of 85 came along. Okay? But the reason they did crop fallow was, number one, to store moisture, but number two, to utilize the nutrients, because organic matter was breaking down when we added moisture. There were no plants taking up the nutrients. So we got the early farmers learned that by fallowing a year, you got better yields than if they had continuous wheat. We've changed that now with no-till, or reduced tillage. And so we're able to conserve moisture in other ways, and actually in some cases build our soils. There's organic compounds that are manufactured by soil microorganisms. These things act like glues or compounds that will actually stick soil particles together, form aggregates, which improves the rooting environment for the plants. It improves the water holding capacity of the plants. It creates some structure that resists erosion. There's also stuff that leaks out of plant roots. Plant roots are leaking. And so, some of the photosynthesis that the plant creates up here and sends out to the roots leak out of the roots. So that also has organic matter. So there's a lot of sources of organic matter in the soil. And as land managers, we would like to try to maximize the amount of organic matter that we either put in the soil or maintain or retain in the soil. Organic matter is kind of hard to describe. That's a part of organic matter molecule. Okay? And there's been many scientists that spent their entire lives trying to describe organic matter. We're still working at it because it's very hard to describe. However, you see little dotted lines up there. Those are certain things there that we know occur in organic matter that help influence nutrient cycling, microbial activity, things like that. So the organic matter is sort of a nondescript. I mean, it's very hard to describe that. But there are things there. You've got amino acids, which are nitrogen compounds, form protein. Microbes need protein, so they are able to break those off and utilize that for their protein, cellular protein, things like that. So just, at the end of this, we're going to have a test, and you'll have to draw all of these things, okay? No. Don't worry about it. I don't memorize it yet either. So sort of to summarize, we've got a reservoir for plant nutrients. In other words, it's a source of nutrients for plants. It acts as a glue, which makes it aggregates, and it's also sort of a sponge. Creates a spongy sort of environment for water retention in the soil. Okay. As a nutrient reservoir, the nutrients, yeah, Doug.
I want to hear a lot about the soil, water holding capacity.
Right.
Okay. As we increase this organic matter, is there some sort of a measurement where we maximize how much water that soil could hold?
A lot of it depends on your texture.
Okay.
If you got a sandy soil, you're not going to hold as much as clay. But the thing about it is that if you've got structure, and you have a heavy rainfall, you're not going to have as much of a runoff. You're going to move it into the soil. If you move it into the soil, then it's probably going to be available for plant growth. Because anything that runs off wasted water. And in this world, some of you older guys probably remember Tom Conlon. His statement, you know, your boss, his statement was, drought is a natural condition out here. And you think about it, you know, this is considered semi-arid. So, yeah, drought is a natural condition. And if you can retain as much water as you can, not lose it, you know, you're ahead because the crops that you're growing out there need that water.
I'll get Larry, a third of the years from back 1900 to today, a third of the years are either wild or severe drought.
Right. And that's probably a ninth to a third more than we see in the eastern part of the state. And I'd have to go back and look at the records, but yeah, this is a very, I mean, this is the nature of the environment out here, the climate out here. And it varies from year to year, so I mean, it's not something that, you know, we can say for certainty, but we can say for certainty that our odds of being dry are probably greater than odds of being wet out here, just because of the climate. So anything we can do to improve the structure, to capture that water and move it into the soil. And this was in the old crop fallow days. This is why people would fallow and till it up, fluff it up, because it was supposed to capture the rainfall. Well, there are some other things, but when you tilled it, you also lost a lot of water because any moisture was trapped there, you inverted it, brought it up and evaporated it off. So you weren't very efficient in those days. And this is where no-till has sort of come into play, because you're not disturbing the soil, you're developing the structure. You rarely will see heavy runoff off of croplands with no-till, because it's got pores in it. They're bigger pores so water can flow in easily. Some of the pores are made by those little critters called earthworms too. They're called macropores. And we had a long discussion on the benefits and disadvantages of those, but all of those things help get water into the soil. Stored salt water in a dry year is going to make you much more money than if you don't have it at all. In fact, when I first came back in the mid to late 80s, even up in the early 90s, NDSU had a program. John Adams, who was a climatologist at that time, he and Landblom would have this stored salt water. I can't remember what the name of the project, but what they would do is have county agents and NRCS people go out and take a random sampling of the field, sample soils down to a certain depth, and then send the soils into campus and determine how much moisture was had accumulated in the soil profile. I think it was like a 3-foot profile, 2 or 3-foot profile. And I don't remember the exact, what the cutoff point was, but after a certain amount of moisture, just to get a crop up and growing, each inch of extra stored soil water was worth 6 bushels of spring wheat yield. So that stored soil moisture is very important, and that's where the aggregation, the good structure comes in. The other thing, when there was a crop fallow and a lot of tillage, you get a heavy rain and you just beat that surface down and you lost that porosity, that infiltration. That's when you start getting runoff, you start getting erosion, you start getting rilling, you start getting gullying, and most of you have probably seen that at some point or other. Because it does rain. There are heavy rains that come through here once in a while. Right? Okay. So, getting back to the nutrients. The soil's sort of like a revolving bank account, and this was what Doug was sort of getting to, is what we think we're seeing here. And when we talk about this revolving bank account, I mean, most of us have got a bank account, you put money in, you take money out as you need it. And sometimes you put more money in, and sometimes you take out more than you have in there, right? And when you take out more, you have a negative balance. Well, you know, we hope that the soil doesn't get this negative balance because you're not going to grow very good crops if you're lacking nutrients. But if you're putting nutrients in there, there's adequate nutrients in there for the crop to grow. So generally, the soil contains all of the essential nutrients that plants require. Because if you think about it, what grew on these soils originally? Plants, range plants. Now, range plants are a little bit different than crop plants, but they're not that much different. It also not only contains it, but it's storage. And the storage is in that organic matter. And as that organic matter decomposes, and organic matter continuously decomposes, with the help of the microbes, the nutrients are released. The soil contains, well, depending on the amount of organic matter, but about 97% of the nitrogen in the soil is in the organic matter. It's not available to plants. So the microbes have to break that down, digest it to release the plant available nitrogen. Organic nitrogen can't be taken up by plants. However, the mineral nitrogen can. So it mineralizes into things like ammonium and nitrate, which is what we put on when we put on fertilizers, right? And also it absorbs the whole plant available nutrients. And this is when we apply fertilizer, for example, things like phosphorus and potassium. The organic matter has some chemical properties that help retain those nutrients and maintain them in an available form for the plants. We hear about fixation, and that we can have a day-long discussion on fixation. But the soils will hold them and store them and keep them in the rooting zone where the plants can utilize it. So when we think about the bank account, this is sort of an artist's diagram here. You've got on the very far left there, you've got the number 4 is stabilized organic matter. That's basically the humus or the organic matter that's kind of inherently in the soil. Next to it there, you've got the decaying compounds, which is the stuff that is kind of broken down, doesn't have any real form to it, but it's not the humus part yet. And then we've got the residue, which would be the plant materials, and the plant materials as they're breaking down that may be on the surface. And so you see there's cycling going on there, but all throughout this thing there's a movement from one pool, we call it, to another. Transfer from one to the other and then back. But eventually what happens is the nutrients, where the number 3 is, are available for the plant to take up. And so because of the revolving account, there's a storehouse there, but it requires microbes, primarily, to get these nutrients released from the organic matter so the plant can grow. But the plant also has some feedback. Yeah?
As you talk about these different zones, those compounds, those residues, I guess maybe I would say residues that have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, are they the ones that would probably be in that number 4, that stable?
No, that would be probably number 2, because it's not going to break down very fast and release a lot of nutrients.
Okay.
The stable stuff is that down there, and that's got a carbon nitrogen ratio of about 10 to 1, 11 to 1. In fact, most of the numbers I've seen, and I've run a lot of carbon nitrogen ratios of North Dakota soil, they run 11 to 1 for North Dakota. That's kind of the norm. And it doesn't make a difference if it's rangeland, cropland, or wetland. That's the stable carbon nitrogen ratio. The residues will probably have something like 80 to 1, meaning there's not going to be a lot released, but the microbes also need those carbon compounds. There's sugars, and then there's proteins, there's cellulose, and all kinds of stuff that the microbes need as energy sources. Just like we need energy sources. How many runners in here? Anybody runners? Some of us are getting too feeble to do that. Doug is. Yeah. What do you want for energy? Carbohydrates, right? generally. Yeah, those are carbon nitrogen compounds. It's organic matter. that provides energy. So the carbon provides the energy, and the other things are the nutrients that are building blocks for the microbes and for the plants. So essentially what you have, as all this cycling goes on, there's a movement of nutrients to the plant. It releases the nutrients are taken up by the plant grows, the residue goes back, there's some leakage back out of the roots. If you've got a legume, you're going to have nodules form, those nodules slough off, they're going to contain a fair amount of nitrogen, they're going to go back into that, generally into the residue pool, the stuff that's cycling the fastest. And that's probably got a life of months to 1 or 2 years. The second group is about 4 to 20 years, and stabilized, it probably cycles every 20 years, you get a complete turnover. So those are sort of the relative ways that they function. Well, the nutrient sources, the main ones that are in organic matter, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Nitrogen is part of protein. Okay? And all microorganisms are just like us humans or livestock. You gotta have a certain amount of protein to have a healthy animal, have a healthy critter. So all of these nutrients are required. The sulfur is too. Sulfur is part of is also part of proteins. Phosphorus is the energy systems in cells. In us, in livestock, in plants, and microbes. That's the energy currency. They also need, like I mentioned, the carbon compounds, sugar, starches, cellulose for that energy. So all of these things are in that organic matter. And organic matter is sort of a generalized term. It can mean anything from plant residues that are starting to decay all the way to that black stuff that makes the soil dark. The microbes are very important in this whole system. As they grow through the life, they break down, they do all kinds of, by a different variety of means. There's different types of organisms. There's fungi, there's bacteria, and there's, I can't remember what, archaea. Archaea are sort of a hybrid between the two that are required to break down organic matter. Generally the fungi work first on that dry residue. They sort of break it down. What they do essentially is they excrete compounds that dissolve the organic matter. That's how they break it down. And by dissolving it, they start getting nutrients out of there. They all need nutrients. And I used to teach soil fertility class, and I was told my students, if you got a wheat field out there and you plow down real heavy residue, your wheat's going to turn yellow, even though your soil test says you've got not enough nitrogen in there. Well, what you've done is you put a lot of food into the soil for the microbes. And it's just like being at a banquet table, or at a table where there's hors d'oeuvres, you got people all around. Those people close to that banquet table are going to eat first and eat the best. The microbes are the closest to that nitrate ion or phosphate ion. They're going to take that out first before the plant gets it. And that's why the plant will show nitrogen deficiency. Now over time, the microbes will die, and when they die, there may be other critters that feed on them. But eventually that nitrogen is released back into the system and becomes plant available. So you can have adequate nitrogen, but if you've got a lot of organic matter that's got a wide carbon-nitrogen ratio, you're going to tie up the nitrogen. Because those microbes are first at the banquet table. The amount of activity, there's two things, there's more than two things. Microbes require conditions similar to where we're comfortable. So is everybody comfortable in this room? Temperature-wise, humidity-wise, that's really what microbes, those conditions similar to this. So if your soil temperature is cold, or it's dry, they're not gonna be very functional. They'll function, but they're gonna, you know, just like us going outdoors, even today, if we don't have we have a light shirt on and shorts out there, we're out there for any length of time, we're just not gonna be functioning too well. We're gonna get chilled, we're just not gonna be too happy. Microbes are a lot the same. So if they got, and then the other thing, if we're hungry, most of us get kind of crabby, don't we? Even though some of us may be crabby all the time, but I mean, you know, usually because you're hungry, you're just miserable. And so microbes, if the conditions aren't right, they're not going to do a whole lot. So the microbial activity of the soil is influenced number one by temperature, number two by moisture. But the next big thing is the nitrogen content of the residues. If you've got a lot of carbon and very little nitrogen, they'll just kind of nibble away at it because they need a certain amount of nitrogen, just like their livestock need a certain protein content in their diet to do it. They're a critter just like the rest of us, okay? And so that really influences how fast organic matter will break down, how much nitrogen is in there. Because they need that nitrogen to build their cellular protein, to build their bodies up, just like we do. So the microbes will utilize that soil land before the plants can. And so you put a lot of wheat straw, which has got a carbon-nitrogen ratio of about 80 to 1. And it's not going to break down very fast if there's not enough nitrogen in there for the organisms to break down. They'll break it down, but it's going to be very slow. And I already mentioned this one, that you get yellowing after big residues because microorganisms will use all the nitrogen they can get. So, how do we increase organic matter? And I've worked a lot in this area in a number of different ways. One, you add more carbon to the soil. In other words, probably if we exclude adding manures, which is a good way to do it, but exclude adding manure, just growing crops, we need to add more biomass, more residue back to the soil. Or we decrease the carbon losses. Where do we lose most of our carbon? When we till the soil. Okay. Tillage enhances aeration of the soil. It stimulates microbes to a certain extent. They'll break down the organic matter quicker. So those two really are sort of the same thing, just different sides of the coin. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, we grow high residue crops. Okay, high residue crops, if be things like corn, if you're not trying to get for silage or grazing it off, and small grains. Those are probably two primary high residue groups of crops that we can grow. Reducing tillage. Anytime we disturb the soil, we're enhancing breakdown of organic matter. So going minimum till or no till tends to reduce the amount of organic matter broken down, or the rate that is breaking down. That's no till. Continuous cropping. A number of years ago, I used to work as director of the soil testing lab for a number of years, and I did a little study. We went back through about 15 years worth of our soil tests, and we looked at organic matter, year by year, county by county, and then, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the major land resource areas, NRCS naturally is. Everything almost is done on that basis. But there's major land resources there. This area here is called MLRA 54, which is what, the rolling shale plain? I think that's what it is. And there's a number, there's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's 7, I think, main ones in North Dakota. Anyhow, we went through this, did 15 years, and I split it up by 5-year groups. And this was from 1985 to 2000. as the years we looked at. Just look at our archive data. And it was interesting. What was interesting was there was evidence in there that the Farm Bill of '85, which required maintaining 30% residue on the surface, and some other things, to prevent erosion. This also was responsible for CRP. But that had a big impact on carbon levels, particularly out here in MLRA 54 and 58, which is on the other side of the Missouri River, to the west here. Over that 15-year period, we saw increases of around 11% in this carbon. Now, realize that we don't know if the fields were sampled every time each year over this period, or 3 times, but generally farmers who send in samples would sample them on some regular basis. But over that 15-year time period, we had about 11% increase, and as I recall, it was about 6% here in MLRA 54. And the other parts of the state were small, but not big. In fact, 53A, A up north, or is it B? I think it's A. Had some loss. 53 is the tilt plain, east of the Coteau. Had some losses. But what was really interesting was that there were such high increases over in this part of the country. Well, part of it is that prior to '85, there was a lot of crop fallow. In fact, when we did our carbon survey in 92, 93, there was anywhere from about 35 to 85% of the land based on North Dakota Ag Statistics was in crop fallow. But because of the 1985 Farm Bill and the need to maintain residue, a lot of farmers out here went to no-till and continuous cropping. Well, what did that do? That increased the carbon biomass inputs into the soil, because you're now growing a crop every year, mostly small grains, but you're still growing a crop every year, and you weren't tilling to break down the organic matter as quickly. And it just really stood out, because there was a big jump between 85 and 90, and then not as big a jump from 90 to 95, 95 to 2000. So continuous cropping has a lot of effect in there. And now, yeah.
If you're going to cover this later, it's fine. You'd mentioned corn and whether you grazed it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is always, by grazing it, how much of those nutrients actually leave the ground or convert? How much do we really lose by grazing that corn?
I really can't give you an answer, because I really don't know, but I think that we actually are conserving some of them because of the animal droppings in the urine. You know, we're taking off a lot of carbohydrate, you know, which is what helps the animal grow, gain weight. And then you leave, the roots are there, so half the plant is essentially left behind. And that is decomposing slowly, because we're not disturbing it, we're not tearing it up, it just stays there and breaks down over time. So the reason I said that, probably the worst case is taking off silage, where you basically take all of the top part of the plant off. You take it away, and you're exporting it to the farm yard, okay? And you're probably not importing back the manure that it generates. So if you're grazing it, you're probably not doing too bad. But again, there's still enough root biomass. Corn is a C4 plant, which is very efficient in fixing carbon, and also tends to put more carbon into the roots. So that also helps. So you've got several things going for you here that...
Well, if I graze it, the leaves don't blow away and the poop stays.
You're right. Yeah, the leaves blowing away is another problem. Your neighbor might get all that organic matter. Or it might be down in the creek. It's not very good. So, but today now we're going, you know, we're emphasizing some of these cover crops. Mainly because there's also issues with nutrient loss by leaching and by runoff into streams. And you probably don't know much about it, but I've been working with the health department. There's some issues. It depends what EPA ends up doing to us one of these days. But the health department, the water quality guys are concerned. Our water quality as a whole in North Dakota is not too bad, but EPA's got a way of elbowing in and imposing their will on people. So, but if we can capture those nutrients, keep them from leaching, or running off and surface runoff, by having a crop growing there and then recycling them, because that's essentially what you're doing. You're essentially conserving the nutrients and not exporting them by some means. So, and that kind of tends to show, well, some slides I'll show here shortly that sort of tend to give proof to that. So Doug talked a bit about, the crop sequence, so I won't spend much time. I'm moving into some of this work with Doug here. So we've already got that. And the comparisons, what we've been really looking hard at are the spring wheat either as a control or in the rotational system. This is a picture here of some of the cover crop. Doug's been putting out, it's got some irrigation pipe buried in there, so we can exclude roots from areas, so we can compare areas that got plants growing in them with areas of the soil that don't have any plants growing in them to see what the difference of root uptake might be on the mineralization and availability of nutrients. And so you can kind of, you don't see them very well, but you see a cylinder there. They're cleverly hidden. There's one over there, and there's one somewhere down in here. I can't pick it out from where I'm standing. But so anyhow, and this is data that came out of the work this past year. I've looked at nitrate. These have been sampled on about 3-week intervals throughout the growing season. And as you can see that in the spring, the nitrate is fairly low. And some of those jumps there, I'm not sure when you guys put them on fertilizer, Doug. Is it at seeding? When are you putting on your fertilizer? At seeding?
Just before.
Just before seeding. So it would have been applied there. The yellow line down there is a grassland control. There's 3 plots out there that Doug's been sampling to compare what's going on in a grassland compared to the cropland. There's not a lot of available nitrogen in that grassland. Okay, but you can see what happened. The outside is that light green line, and the inside is a dark green line. And you can see that in the rotational, there's not a lot of nitrogen, nitrogen in the areas where the roots are able to take it up. To exclude the roots, it goes up fairly high. However, if you look at that control, where we haven't had the influence of these other crops, the nitrogen is mineralized fairly quickly. Okay? So theoretically, we're not conserving that nitrogen as, nitrogen. So what we're doing is delaying the nitrate pretty much in the rotational, because it's coming from the mineralization from the organic matter that's there. This other is probably more due to the fertilizer that's applied to it. as well as what's being cycled. So there are some actual differences, this isn't necessarily bad, there's not a lot of nitrogen. If you look at this number of pounds of nitrogen, at the end of the season, we're talking about 150 plus pounds of nitrogen, available nitrogen, in a 2-foot profile. It's a lot of nitrogen. Okay? But you also have a lot here, even higher than that here. So you're not going to lose as much nitrogen here if you get a heavy raining period as you will here. If you look at the scale, the different scales. Now, that's probably why we're seeing the reduction of nitrogen during the season, need for nitrogen during the growing season for the crops, because it's cycling in there. Now, there's not been a lot of work, there's been a lot of work done on cycling, but not in systems like this, and this is why it makes this study sort of interesting. You know, the problem we have from research, we'd like to know what the flow is, but we're cycling at points in time. So we're just getting snapshots. And these lines are sort of, we're continuing the snapshots. But if you look at that in those exclusionary areas, there's a lot of nitrogen in those plots. And it isn't coming all from fertilizer, because there wasn't more than 40,000 fertilizer. It's coming from cycling with that organic matter. From the microbes breaking down what's in there. And the fact is, in this rotation, there are 2 phases in there. There's legumes, the pea barley and the hairy veg triticale. And then also there's some legumes in the cover crops. I don't know what you got here. Soybean. You got pea in the cover crop.
Yeah, field pea is your legume.
Your main one, yeah.
Yeah, and then.
Sunflower
Yeah, sunflowers.
and some grass.
Grass and stuff.
So what's happening is there's a lot of cycling going on. We've also looked at the total mineral. In the pictures, this is ammonium plus nitrate. Now, most of the time in soil testing, we don't worry about ammonium because ammonium converts to nitrate pretty fast. Okay, so they're a big conversion, so we don't look at it, but here we've got an opportunity to look at a snapshot in point in time to see what's in there. There's a heck of a lot of nitrogen in there. We're talking about in the rotation, almost 300 pounds where the roots aren't growing. I don't know, it's not that high, 280, 90, something like that. And only about 75% of that in the control. So by having those legumes in there and getting that organic matter cycling, we are cycling a lot of nitrogen, which is why we're being able to reduce the nitrogen application and also increase the yields because we've got sort of a continuous supply of nitrogen. Usually when you put on mineral nitrogen in the spring, either as anhydrous ammonia or urea or something like that, you've got a big slug going on. And then you get a rainy period, someone leaches, someone denitrifies, someone goes deep, it's out of the rooting zone. And so we're not able to utilize that nitrogen as efficiently. Yeah.
Given those amounts that you see on the slide, there's over 250 pounds per acre. Are under a fairly wet situation, would we actually be leaching? Are we actually produce too much?
Well, you know, you remember 2014, they kind of went down toward the end of the season because we had all that rain in August. And we may have denitrified somewhat or leached it out of the 2-foot zone. Yeah, that's one thing we don't know where it's going necessarily, but yeah, we can actually lose that. But as long as we got plants growing in there, cover crop or something, to utilize that, we're capturing and maintaining it available for plants over the growing season. If we get an organic matter, tied up in organic matter, especially that cover crop, which is very tender stuff, you know, most of the water anyhow. I did some work down at Foreman a couple years ago as a student, and we had some cover crops. We looked at residues, carbon nitrogen contact residues and of radish and field pea, I think, at the end of the season. That radish and field pea were growing, they were like 85% water, you know, so you don't have a lot of biomass there, but you've got a lot of nitrogen. The CN ratios are very narrow in those, even in a radish. Do you have another? Yeah, question.
So from a holistic farm management standpoint, this is where you'd see kind of some of the economic savings, because this is nitrogen.
Well, yeah, and it's also environmentally friendly, because we're not losing it. And one of the things that we've been tasked for, and I'm battling some people within our own department about this, BMPs, best management practices, for nitrogen, to retain nitrogen, keep from losing nitrogen to either surface or subsurface waters. And so there's a lot of other implications here that go beyond the scope of this study. But I think what's been interesting about this study is that it really illustrates that cycling that's going on. We've enhanced the cycling, because if you look at the control versus, and look at the scales, you know, even 50 pounds is a lot of nitrogen. It's $25 worth, well, it's probably not that much today. I think it'll be about 45 cents now. But yeah, we figure for urea, we're usually about, for anhydrous ammonia, about 50 cents a pound, kind of rule of thumb. You know, that's $25 off the top, or on the top.
And wheat's only $4.50 on a good day in the cash market. And that's when you need every dollar you can get.
Yep, exactly. So to summarize it, you know, Mineralization tended to be higher, and I didn't show the ammonia because I'm not sure how to interpret it. I'm not sure there are very many other people who do, because we normally don't look at that from soil standpoint. But if you look at the total N, because plants can take up ammonia just as well as they take up nitrate. Except most of the time it's mostly nitrate, so they take up the nitrate. Especially grass plant, corn, and wheat. So, anyhow, showing that there's decreased soil test and requirements and yield increase in the rotation system. I think what's happening here is that the N cycling is increasing due to microbial activity, and the diversity appears to be enhancing soil health and productivity. We've done some other work down at Foreman on some cropping systems, long-term cropping systems. And diversity doesn't always increase soil organic matter. Because in some of these systems you may have a corn, winter wheat, spring wheat, soybean, or I think in one system we had flax. That soybean is a low residue crop. We've got one system there we looked at 2 years of alfalfa. Now, first time you hay alfalfa in a no-till system, you remove all of the residue off the surface. You bale it up.
Yeah.
So you lose that organic matter.
Because it's
To the system, yeah. But we just had a paper, Amit Chatterjee, the colleague of mine, just published a paper that I contributed to in the Agronomy Journal, first issue of this year, talking about this. The diversity doesn't necessarily mean more organic matter. Corn is a big impact in the eastern part of the state because you apply a lot of residue in a corn crop. You know, 5 to 7 tons, depending on the corn crop. And usually that's related to yield. Wheat, less, but still quite a bit, and then soybean doesn't have a lot. You may have, you know, if you really look at it, you may have, barely have enough cover there to cover your bed for erosion. Mitigation. So, anyhow, bottom line, it looks like it's enhancing the soil health productivity. Other thing I wanted to point out that we've looked at this data here, looking at organic matter in some of these plots versus the, and this is basically got control plots over time, that for each percent organic matter is worth about 8 pounds of nitrogen. So if we increase organic matter and under this environment, we can increase the total available nitrogen about 8 pounds. Now, that's an estimate, but 8 pounds is still $4 an acre. You can say that. I took the slide out. I had another talk at Oaks. There's some older work that was done there. Walt Elvis, who used to be the manager there. This is from the 80s and 90s, looking at organic matter in their controlled corn plots and their yields, just plotting against yield. 1% organic matter with about 50 bushels of corn out there. This is irrigated corn. So that would be about 50 pounds of it. And some of that's been worked into our, Dr. Franz has put some of that into the the latest wheat recommendations. If you get a continuous no-till wheat, you can take a 50-pound credit for continuous no-till. I don't know, again, this is the best data we have at this time. It may be more, it may be less, but it's probably a good rule of thumb.
That's not irrigated.
This? No, that's rainfall. This is what I call a cobblestone soil. This is up in Sheridan County. We were working on a carbon project up there, and we ran across the slides up there. This was in CRP at one time, and the landowner had his tenant take it out of CRP and plant barley in there. And that was about a 15 bushel barley crop stubble in there, but it kind of rattles when you run your drill through there.
I was wondering what the repair bill is on the,
I don't know, that wasn't going to ask.
on the cedar and
But
on the
there's some,
combine.
there were some, fairly sizable 4 or 5 acre patches in this field. There's a couple of them that I saw, there may have been more. Any questions?
Just a comment on when you're talking about the residue issue. What we started to look at is on our native range, there's about 70% on native range on a decent range patch that's grass, so high carbon and nitrogen, and the rest is forbs and lower carbon and nitrogen. So in designing a crop rotation, that's kind of what we're after, because once your system starts to cycle, you do eat up a lot more of your residues. So
Right.
if we can design it, we can stack some of our wheat or corn or something.
Yeah.
We try to do that more. And it's
Yeah, I've been trying to get some funding to work back down to Foreman on something. There's a lot of residue accumulation. And the corn yields are about everything between 130 and 140 bushels. We're putting on about 140 pounds of N annually on some of that stuff. But I just like to get a study started out there looking at just nitrogen rates, superimpose nitrogen rates on these long-term high residue plots. Because, I had a student look at it, and we, using just classical methods of, so much is going to be decomposed, you need so much, you get so much carbon, so much nitrogen, decompose it, or to satisfy the decomposition requirement. And we know that that's not going to be all necessary in the first year, but if we look at all the residue in some of these no-till plots, it looks to me like we need to add more nitrogen, but there's nothing in the literature anywhere. I mean, anywhere. The problem with a lot of this carbon work is people go out there and put in a 2, 3, 4 year study, beginning to end. Oh yeah, by the way, we'll sample organic matter. And then they make organic matter and call it carbon sequestration. That is not carbon sequestration. And these long-term plots are really what are really valuable. And administrators don't always see it because They think it's a money sink. But, man, we got some sites around there that are just treasures, and if we could just put some studies on these things and really look at it carefully, convince people that that's important. I put some money into the Corn Council this year to look at corn, but they're on a very tight budget because the corn price is low. So they haven't been funding much, but these sorts of things are really, I mean, they're really cool things to look at. And when we're integrating this grazing with the crop production and then looking at the economics, I think there's, it's interesting. And we really don't have, it's also hard to publish some of this stuff because it's really hard to control the environment. This study is pretty well set up because it's replicated. A lot of studies are not replicated, that makes it much more difficult. This is exciting because I think it's illustrating something. And this year it may be different, but the weather conditions. So it may be somewhat weather dependent, but I think over the long term, if you look at it, there's some cool stuff going on out there. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned grazing and microbial communities. Is there work done that looks at what the effect of actually having grazing animals on there versus a similar rotation without grazing animals and the effect on the microbial community?
Not so much on the microbial part. The microbiologists are specialized people. And most of us are not. we deal with things we understand, And so a lot of that work really needs to be done, but we don't have the people who've got the background in it, unfortunately. But yeah, this area is rich for new research. Very rich. Yeah.
There, you've got a couple of here who farm under irrigation centers. And most of what we talk about is dealing with dryland. What kind of comments or suggestions do you have for those farmers who are working in irrigated situations?
The sandy soils are medium.
Sandy, yeah.
Sandy?
Quite sandy.
Yeah, it keeps on growing on there all the time. Try to capture that nitrogen because you're going to lose it. It's going to leach. But if you can capture it, keep it in the organic matter as much as possible, you're less likely to get leakage of that nitrogen out of the system. It just depends on the system you've got. But I've worked on some no-till, not at Oaks, some no-till corn, doing some infiltration studies on some reservoir removal stuff. Man, I'll tell you, you can't keep water on some of that stuff because of the micropores in the sand. This is sand down there, and irrigated sand, and part of it because of all the earthworms. I mean, there's really the earthworm burrows, which are macropores, which are like siphon tubes, they just suck it down. And when we remove the organic matter, we got 100% residue removal, such as baling your corn stalk, which there's a lot of it from time to time. It does impact those sandy soils because there are no earthworms in there. What was always interesting, we used a simple single-radium filtrometer, drive it in the ground, maintain a constant head. And at the end, you pull them up, pull them out, and where you had 100% residue left on the surface, there'd be 5 earthworms that are waving at you. And where all the residue removed, maybe you had 1. Earthworms tend to be top feeders, or feed near the surface. Most of them, there are some other species, but the bulk of the species feed at the top. So if you've got a residue on top, you go up there, grab it, take it down, chew it up, eat it. But they leave those burrows, they call them macropore flow of water that
So, under our dry conditions, that's an advantage for us with the
Right.
earthworms, because We want infiltration, we got.
Well, infiltration, especially if you got some stratification of sand. Sands tend to stratify, probably more so than some of the other soils. Because some of the other soils don't have clay in there, so when they let it dry, they shrink and swell. And they break up any compaction, but sands don't do that because they don't have that shrink swell. They're just sand. Packed sand, basically, what you have. But if you get that organic matter, that's some aggregation, it's gonna make that soil more of a sponge and not, hold that water there.
What advantage would you see to grazing in a center-pivot situation?
Advantages? You're spreading a lot of the residue back around in the urine, so you're putting a lot of that nitrogen back on there. If you get a cover crop on there, which in our climate is, we're in an area where it's kind of tenuous where the cover crops, one year may work, another year may not because of early fall or dry fall or wet fall or, our climate is so variable. If you get a cover crop on and graze that would be okay. Again, you gotta watch out for mold and things like that, but that can be controlled.
I know an individual who has set up a pivot so that as it moves, it actually has a fence in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that moves with the pivot. The cattle graze right behind that pivot.
Okay, sure, yeah.
It goes around the field.
Mm-hmm.
And they're grazing a tremendous amount of beef
Oh, yeah.
under that pivot.
You get all those shucks that are left behind and leaves and grain that's scattered out there, yeah.
And,
Any other questions? I've told you all I know, so I'll turn it back to Doug. He knows more than I do now at this point.
well, thank you, Larry. The more I learn, the more I hear, the less I think I know some days. And I don't know very much to begin with. Yeah, we could. I think. That is, yeah, so sure. There you go.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we'll shift gears now, we'll go back to livestock and spend a little time visiting about, you saw the system and what we were doing with the grazable crops. And now we'll talk about kind of some of the data that came out of that. And basically, what we did was we put together a grazing system, and I think you saw Larry use the word sequence. So we've got a sequence of forages. We begin out here with native range. And that native range, we take those yearling steers, we've wintered them, either grazing corn stalks and some hay supplement, or now we're moving to a situation where they're probably in dry lot a little bit more. But after growing at a fairly slow rate, gain pound a day, pound a quarter, something like that, so we're not putting a lot of weight on them. Fairly green steers when they get out on native pasture. And that's the idea, is we're not putting a lot of weight on during the winter months so that we can get a good response in this situation and they don't go out there and lose weight. That's what you don't want to do with yearlings. If you're going to graze them, you don't want to put much weight on them because they will, let's say there'll be a form of an equilibrium. They'll take that fat that they put on in a dry lot and they'll go out there for about the first month and lose weight and then start to gain again. So that's not a good idea to have them very fleshy. Anyway, starting with fairly green steers, graze that native range for about 113 days. And what's going on there is we're putting pounds on, but at the same time we're waiting for that field pea barley crop to grow so we've got something to graze, okay? And then we did some work, and I don't have a slide here, but we did some work taking a look at, excuse me, forage quality as we moved through these different crops in the sequence. And we found when we got to this field pea barley, if we swathed it, we were able to capture the nutrient quality when we laid it down, rather than letting it stay standing and continue to mature that way. So we took advantage of that. It isn't huge, 1.5% crude protein or something like that. But the other thing, and what I'd like to have done is to trap some soluble sugars there. Unfortunately, in terms of sugars, we hear talk about sugars, the stoma in the plant leaf stays open. Once you swath that, it stays open for a little while, and as that plant is drying, those sugars are getting away from you, and they're getting out of the plant, and so we don't have as much as was in that plant at the moment we whacked it off, laid it down. So we're losing some of those sugars. But we still have decent protein, and we're getting, it varies by year though. The interesting part is it varies by year in terms of average daily gain. Some years I've gotten as high as 3 pounds a day gain on this, and one year, I can't explain it, but it popped just a little under 2. And so what happened there? I don't know what happened, but anyway, the gain slower. But anyway, here's it is being laid down by Gary, and here they are in the windrow there. They're about a month, kind of a protein bridge between the native range and here, and then the unharvested corn, and they indeed go into green corn in the fall of the year. But it doesn't stay green very long. Pretty soon it looks like it's time to combine the corn, and I do have, I think we got 8 combines there. And they graze off that corn. And in this situation, it's going to be rough. I mean, it's not like we went through with a machine. They have stalks and they eat leaves and they knock it over and they do whatever. But we come behind, and I'll show you a little bit later, we come behind these areas and we graze that rough, coarse residue material with cows, with gestating cows. So we actually graze those corn stalks 2 times. Once with high value animals and the other one with maintaining brood cows. So then we get into the feed yard. We've left here, we come into the feed yard, we're there about 74 days, and then they're ready for the slaughter. And these are those animals hanging on the rail down at Fort Margaret, Colorado, in the Cargill plant.
Doug, did you say what the daily gain was on the corn?
It's about 1.8 to 2 pounds a day. I did not say that. But
That was on which?
just on the corn itself, you're going to see a little better gain here in this. Now, if we take a look at the performance of those yearling steers during the entire growing period from native range all the way through the whole sequence, just summarized as a whole, about 219 days of grazing, and that about lines up with the control cattle that went directly to the feed yard. So you're in the feed yard all the time. These guys are out grazing, see, okay? So we've got 2 frame sizes. We've got some large frame steers, we've got some small frame steers, yellow bars on the small frames, the ugly looking colored ones on the large frame steers. Starting weight, about 100 pounds difference here. And at the ending weight, coming off the corn in the end, we got 1,264 pound steers versus basically 1,100 pound cattle. You can see our gain, 507 pounds versus 445, and the cost per head was actually a little bit cheaper compared to our large frame steers, but that doesn't continue to hold. You see in the large frames here, in terms of average daily gain, they get around 2.3 versus, so about 1/3 of a pound faster for those large frame cattle. And the grazing cost per pound of gain was lower for the large frame cattle than the small ones because of the increase in average daily gain. If I talked to Larry just before our meeting, Larry Schnell, and I asked him, well, what's the value of those cattle when they came out of the corn? And based on today's price, those 1,100 pound steers, he thought would be around $1.42, and our 1,260 some pound steers around $1.30. So you can see here, what's there, about $85 difference, 15.58 versus 16.43 coming out of that grazing program. So there is some value today, at least there's still pretty good value in the grazing program. One thing that we've done though is this is where Dr. Santukla thought she put some funny stuff in here. I'm not big on things that dissolve and move and jump around, so we might have some more movement on slides. Anyway, if you look at average daily gain, you can see our feedlot cattle that went directly to the feed yard in May when these yearlings went out to grass. You can see that there's quite a significant compensatory growth here once those animals get to the feed yard, and that weighs heavily on the number of days in the feedlot. And the other thing that AM's always liked is that when these animals are grazing, through that sequence of forages, we are increasing body composition. We are increasing marbling in our steers as we are grazing. And I didn't put that slide in here today, but we are putting on about, compared to an all grass type of situation where you'd be grazing just pasture and not annual forages, we're increasing the marbling score by about one marbling score from basically from a select to an average choice steer in this grazing situation. So that's valuable, and it also plays in heavily into how long these animals are on feed before we can send them to slaughter.
And your ribeye are bigger too, right? Seems like.
I think we had a little bit bigger ribeyes, but the intramuscular fat was the big value that really plays into the value of carcasses when you're selling on a grid basis. If we look at feed per head per day, it just makes sense that these cattle would probably eat less. These actually ate a little bit more, these grazing cattle, because once they got there, they were heavier to begin with. Consequently, their average daily feed intake in pounds per day it's just going to be bigger cattle, and they eat more. But look at their feed efficiency. Not quite 2 pounds less per pound of gain, but certainly efficiency and that whole relationship between average daily gain and the amount of feed intake. Feed cost per pound of gain translates here right away. You see you've got 25 cents there or so, something like that difference in cost per pound of gain, and that's significant. And it certainly pays out in terms of net return per head on those cattle. Marbling score, our smaller frame steers had a significantly higher marbling score, and that obviously would translate into a higher number of cattle that were that graded percent, either choice or prime, choice or higher at least. But those kinds of things in the grand scheme of feeding cattle, they help, but they don't necessarily translate into net dollars, largely because it's really, like any of these things that we do, it's pounds in the scale. It's really weight, and you'll see that here coming up. If we look at net return per head, these cattle were heavier at the end, and also price. We have a price differential too, but the price differential favored these grazing. It's hard to overcome these grazing cattle because we just got less invested in them, and they bring us more net dollars in that system. Now, we gave you those numbers earlier on about what were they worth, the steers were worth. If we had sold them, let's say at stocking season, at the end of the grazing period rather than putting them in the feed yard, well, we actually captured more dollars in that finishing period because it's such a short, compressed period of time, and we're able to sell them on a higher market and on the grid and take advantage of that because of what these cattle do in terms of their other quality grades. You notice that we're large frame. We're talking about large and small frames. There's two different kinds of cattle. And you can kind of tend to see the difference in the frames of these cattle. That's not a whole scene, but it sure shows kind of a white belt there. Anyway, if you take a look at those cattle and you consider about a 20% increase in stocking rate due to that, to this small animal and the number of animals that given land area would carry. When I calculate those things, I still find that my larger frame steers will bring me another, $80-some, $85 per head compared to these smaller frame cattle. So I guess I'm still kind of a medium to large frame beef person. Any questions on that?
The small frame cattle, were they the low line crossbred?
Yeah, but that's the only ones we got access to, that Chris been breeding up those small frame, larger. And when you get into that discussion, it is a good discussion, because once those animals leave the range and you've sold cattle, you've now moved them out of the range environment, and you've now moved them into backgrounding and finishing. We have a divide, and we just saw that divide. And the other way that you can take advantage of that is if you retain ownership from birth all the way to slaughter. But if you want to sell them and you are the buyer of these type of cattle, and you look at how those cattle will perform, then you've got a different set of numbers to look at. So it depends on which side of that equation you're on, in whether you're going with a smaller frame animal. And our cattle have gotten big. I mean, cattle are big today. But I don't, except for a few producers, I don't see a lot of folks backing away from these larger frame cattle. I just don't see it. I know we get a lot of lip service, we get a lot of conversation, but when it comes right down to it, when you go down, I was at a sale on Tuesday, I guess it was, and I watched smaller frame cattle just get clobbered in the ring. And you know, we can talk about it, and we can talk about the efficiencies, we can talk about the numbers, we can look at what happened, and you may raise smaller frame cattle, and if that formula works for you, and it is, you know, really bringing you some good money return, then you don't change, you don't make any changes. But I'm seeing these other folks and I'm going, wow, that's a lot of dollars. Yeah.
Why do the smaller framed cattle do better marbling than the larger?
Oh, that's just a function of the physiology of the animal. They tend to mature at an earlier rate. You take me and you take Larry, and one of those ladies that were in here earlier. Now, Larry and I, we matured, and now what are we doing? We're putting it on, aren't we?
Put a marble.
No, well, you were.
Yeah.
We're marbling.
Become a choice.
Okay, if you take a look at animals mature and reach physiological maturity at different ages. And in beef cattle, those animals that tend to have larger frames tend to reach what we would call physiological maturity at a later age than the smaller framed animals, okay? So then they take, when I say physiological maturity, we've reached the point where we're no longer necessarily building bone, we might be building muscle, but more importantly, what we're doing when we reach physiological maturity is we're laying down fat. We're storing fat better. So, and guys like me did it a lot sooner than big frame guys like Larry. So that's what it is. And that younger animal, that smaller framed animal at the same age is laying down fat sooner and consequently marbling, and which gives you a higher grade. Because in the beef cattle industry, we're selling fat, pure and simple. But we're also selling tenderness, juiciness, flavor, and that comes with fat that's in the meat tissue. So. And something like really lean meat that is, grass-fed or grass-finished, that sort of thing. Something like that flavor. I don't particularly care for it, but that's personal preference, whatever you like to eat. I have another project here we can talk about, or are you about 45 minutes to an hour?
I can do any.
You can do anything.
I can do any amount you say,
Long or short?
long or short.
Tim, he's always so agreeable. Well then, if that's the case, I was looking at about 3:30, so for finishing. So if maybe I can walk through this piece here in about 10 minutes. That'd give you a half hour, 40 minutes, something like that. 40 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. Took a look at some work in this study as well, looking at those residues. And basically, what would those residues do in terms of reducing the wintering costs of maintaining cows? And so I looked at a group of cows that we would call a control, that we just fed hay and supplement in dry lot. Then we took another group of cows and we grazed these cover crops that you saw, some corn and sunflower residues, and when they grazed through all of that material out there on the fields, they went to the dry lot and were fed hay. Then we had some grass, basically grown and crested grasses, in some different lots, and so we grazed those grasses, and then we also had some corn residue, so we came off the grasses and we went to corn residue and finished up there, and then those cows went and grazed, or fed hay done until calving and beyond. Basically a 2-year study, we had 144 cows, they were May, June calving cows. There were 48 cows in each of those treatments. 134-day wintering period, and it's on owned land. And when I visit with Levi, we got a huge deal between owned land and rented land. So, because I could calculate owned land a whole lot easier than I could rented land, Levi said no problem, but not for me. Anyhow, so I did it on owned land, and rented land, of course, as you know, pushes the price of wintering up if you're renting those lands to graze on. We did feed them a couple of pounds of a 32% supplement that cost $339.25 at the time, paid $65 a ton. Our breeding started on August 10th, and the farming charges, except for the pastures, the stockpile grasses, we charged them at kind of a regular rate, but all of the other charges for those residues were charged to the farming enterprise, so we didn't have near as much expense. You take a look at the cover crop and the corn sunflower experiment. Here's what that cover crop looked like in, I don't know if you can see that date, but I think it's September. And here it is out in November, after we got the frost and it froze down. And then the cows went into corn residue after those yearlings had left, and then they grazed these sunflower windrows out there. And of all of those crops, actually the sunflower residue is really put gain on the cows. The cows gained weight on the sunflower residue, and in some cases it kind of held their own, or maybe even went backwards just a little bit on these other crops. Now the cows had some conditions, so they could lose a little weight. I mean, a cow would make a whole lot of difference because they're not feedlot cattle, but you know, we give up a little weight here, we put some weight back on here, and didn't have too much of a total change on the cattle, but by and large, we'll see how those numbers worked out. We put some weight on these cows as a whole.
So did you supplement all of them equally?
Yeah, even the ones in dry lot cover. So
With protein?
yeah. So that there wasn't bias there.
Did you notice a difference in usage of the protein between like cover crops?
Gary's feeding them. I just do numbers. He feeds the cattle. Did you see any difference on the supplemented cows that were in dry lot compared to the ones out in the field?
As far as conditioning goes?
No.
The usage, I was wondering between your cover crop and your corn stalks, did you see a difference in how much usage they use the protein and your mineral?
Yeah, that was all the same.
It was the same.
It was free choice then?
Oh yeah, but only so much. Well, free choice to the point of 2 pounds per head per day. So that's not really free choice. It's limit fed, 2 pounds of supplement per day is what it's on. Yeah. So that's not free choice. No. The other project, the other treatment was stockpile tame hay, which is, there's these grass pastures that they grazed along with supplement, corn stalks, and then here's what the corn stalks look like when we took the cows out, and the cows play an important role in the farming side of things. We get this material off the field so that we can farm it next year, so they play a really important role in terms of residue management and being ready to farm the next season. That cover crop mix, Larry was asking me what it was, and I sometimes forget all of these things that are in there, but we had a couple of pounds of sunflower, 20 pounds of everleaf oat, 20 pounds of that legume, flex pea, it was a winter pea, 5 pounds of hairy vetch, a pound of Winfred forage rape, a pound of Ethiopian cabbage, and a pound of 100-leaf turnip. And you can see some of these got some serious costs against them, you know, per pound basis, and those fluctuate. So one year they might be higher than the other, and you would expect these to be higher year in and year out, but I noticed some of these have actually come down in price here recently. So anyway, when you go through the math and add some property tax, cover crop costs, the grazing cost per cow ended up to be about $36.55 as we begin to work our way into that budget, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But if you look at the number of days grazing, you can see that the control, obviously, they didn't do any grazing. Our cover crop with residue grazed 73 days, and where we had stockpile grass plus that corn residue, we got 107 days of grazing on the average over the 2 years. How much hay did those cows eat? And you can see here our control cows use 4,724 pounds. Our residue cows 1,824 pounds, and then our grass cattle, not quite, just shy of 900 pounds of hay during that winter period over those 2 years. This adds up. This is some serious money. And let's take a look at the performance of the cows before we look at the money. But you can see here, those cows started around 1,470, 1,500 pounds. They come out of there putting on a little over 100, 150 pounds here, 100 pounds here, and just a little bit more in terms of the grass residue cows and the number of days of gain, or the amount of gain. You see, there's not much gain. This gain, if you look at that gain, that's really not much more than what you would call fetus and calf. The fetus and the fluids and the tissues and all that, the placenta, that's about what you got there. So when it comes to looking at body condition score change, there was none for those grass cattle. But the other two put on about 7 to 8 tenths of a condition score during that winter period, which really is a function of how much time they spent feeding hay, because that's where they got that extra gain from. As soon as they went on hay, they started came right up to the average daily gain. So I guess what it's really telling me is that we should probably take advantage of some hay there before we go to calving and get that cow. So we're talking a good 11 months, 10 months, probably more like 10 months of this extensive grazing, and they probably need to be getting some. Now they still might be out in the field, but they probably ought to be getting some hay coming up into calving. We look at the breeding cycle and percent calving on those cows. You see some noise here. None of this is statistically different. When you get down to the total percent calving here, you see they trade some places. You know, we got a little higher, lower here, a little higher here, and this is normal. I mean, every group of cows that ever had calves, the first and second breeding cycles are going to be very similar to this situation. Total calving percentage, there's absolutely no difference there, although there's a little bit of an advantage for that cover crop and residue group of cows. But at the same time, when you look at your control in the grass cow, absolutely no difference. So, looks like it's a pretty good way to save a lot of money on terms of dollars and cents, and I think some of you saw this data a few weeks ago, but our hay costs ran from $173 down to $30, so you got $140 some difference between these two situations in just the hay, but we've got some other expenses involved in the cover crop, southern taxes, and the cost of that hay and whatnot. So now we're looking at kind of a 73 versus a 209. So those are some serious dollars as we move into a time frame when cattle are going to be coming down, and Tim's going to talk about that. As our calves are bringing us a little less money, it's important to take advantage of what we can do in terms of reducing the cost of production. And this is a quick way, if you have access to those forages, it's a good way to, residues and rough feeds, and it worked in extremely well into this cropping system. Because now we're taking those residues, we're running them through the cow. We get back to Toby's question about, well, how much did we actually take off of that field? We left all of the residues. It either was standing or ready to be broken down by microbes, or it was manure and urine. The only problem I got with beef cattle is that I wish we could train them to spread uniformly across the field. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. Anyhow, a wind comes along, they bunch up in the corner, and there's lots of manure there, or whatever. But by and large, we haul off the gain with an animal gain. Otherwise, we just maintained an animal like these cows, but we took advantage of that residue. We moved it away. Again, we supplemented the soil, and at the same time, we facilitated residue management for the farming system when we come in to seed and take advantage of that. I think our most naked field is our field pea barley, which goes back to like soybean or dry beans or whatever we're growing that have almost no residue. I mean, those fields look naked when the combine goes through it. It just, combine's just pulverized.
The one thing, from a nutrient management standpoint, you're leaving all your manure on the field, even though it's bunched up in one corner.
Oh, yeah.
Can fix that.
If you put them in the feedlot, you're exporting that from the field. And most of the time, you don't re-import it back to the field. That's where a lot of the nutrient management problems in this country, because we're exporting grain to concentrated areas, and then we never get those nutrients back.
Little electric fence, you can spread those nutrients.
Or move your water supply around, or your supplement supply around.
Yeah, or take advantage of, other than that advantage, if you got it in a feed yard, you gotta haul it back up. If you gotta get it back up, you gotta haul it. So there's an
If
expense.
it's too far, it's all about
Yeah, I'm sure.
12 miles, it doesn't really pay either.
Well, say a salty neighbor, and you get to take advantage of it. But anyway, there's the cows grazing grass, and they did very well. So